Okay, hey guys. So the panel. So the first question is, you were talking, Alexis. You talked about how someone can have the same impact on reducing animal suffering by donating a relatively small amount, like even like if you mentioned like $1.50 for 1 year, and even if that's like 2 orders of magnitude low, like $150 for a year. So do you think, and do you both think that it's morally equivalent to donate a few $100s to ACE-approved charities than to be vegetarian? Should someone do both, or just do whichever one they find easiest? Or
Well, ACE has a broadly sort of consequentialist outlook, so they would consider it sort of to be an equivalence. Although I know John Bachman, who's the director of ACE, doesn't really like to sort of equate them as one choice for another, especially in terms of effective altruism, given that the cost of eating alternatives to meat or animal products is not more expensive. In order to do the most good, you really should be doing both. But it's also important to realize that meat consumption is an ingrained part of our culture and upbringing, and so it's sort of more a thing to do in the meantime as you transition to more effective ways of eating.
Awesome.
Yeah. There is certainly something a little bit trouble. It's a bit like carbon offsetting, isn't it? But somehow it seems worse, actually. My meat offsetting. I'm going to continue to eat meat, but I'm going to donate $150 to the Humane League or whatever for its ads. But there is a little more, I think, to not eating meat yourself. And if I look back and think, so how did I first get interested in the animal issue back in the early 1970s? It was because, more or less by accident, I went to have lunch with somebody who was a vegetarian. And so although I didn't know that until we sat down and had lunch, and he started asking questions about what was in the brownish sauce that was on top of the spaghetti that we were being offered at the Oxford College we were eating at. His spin-off of being a vegetarian wasn't just that he was a vegetarian and didn't cause this harm to animals, it was that he turned me into a vegetarian, and I guess indirectly, therefore, anybody who through my work has become a vegetarian, the credit really belongs to him. So that's just an example to say you never know what impact you're going to have by serving as an example, in addition to the number of animals that you're not requiring to be produced that you'll buy.
Excellent. So Peter, in your talk, you mentioned the relative value, like the relative moral value between humans and non-human animals, which is a very abstract philosophical question, but it does have very applicable, it has applications right now, because we can choose to donate to a human charity or to an animal charity. So for example, the estimate of AMF is $3,400 to save a life. Do you have any rough estimates of how much you would have, how good an animal charity would have to be for you to think it's a better bet to give to an animal charity rather than a human's, or is that a consideration you make?
I don't really have an estimate, and this is in a way something I'm sort of asking for others to help with, trying to say how you do this. One thing you can say, which is a way of avoiding the philosophical question, is that by getting more people to be vegan, you're also contributing to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore you're helping humans as well. And in fact, if the $1.46 figure for a year of being vegetarian. Is it vegetarian or vegan?
It's equivalent to 1 year of dietary change, equivalent to vegetarianism.
Right, vegetarianism. Yeah, okay. So at that rate, this is better value than buying your carbon offsets and other sorts of things that you might do. It's an excellent value just in itself. So there is a good case there. But I really, it's also important not just for choosing between humans charities and animal charities, but between the different animal charities. Because as you were saying, in terms of the numbers definitely dwarf all of the other things, but most of these numbers are chickens. Yeah. Now, I don't want to put down chickens at all, but I think their suffering is horrible, as in that picture you showed, and there's a lot more detail that you and I, I'm sure, could both go into if we had another half hour to talk about what life is like for these factory farm chickens. But if you could prevent more people eating chicken, is that better than preventing a smaller number of people eating pigs, say? Given that pigs do seem to be more intelligent, does that make a difference? Those questions I find really difficult.
Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, basically it's a tough consideration. There's no good answer at this point in time. Basically, ACE's thinking at the moment is that the number of chickens, per cow, or number of fish per cow would generally compensate. Although that's, they could be wrong. There's simply not a good enough understanding of comparable degrees of sentience to make a really good judgment on that.
Hey, great. So what are your thoughts on kind of more experimental interventions to save animal lives, relative to promoting veganism, things like the Non-Human Rights Project, which is a group of lawyers trying to get certain human rights for chimpanzees, which I think the idea is for it to then expand to other animals, and also creating artificial meat and research into that area, the relative value of that compared to traditional vegan advocacy.
Yeah, so the Non-Human Rights Project, I think, is an interesting attempt to get more awareness of how narrow the gulf between us and non-human animals is in many respects. And I think that it's important for that. It's not the number of chimpanzees that would be affected by a change of law in the United States is very small. I mean, I guess it's in the hundreds anyway. So it's tiny compared to factory farming. And although it's really terrible that they live in these confined cages conditions, still, I don't think you could justify the effort on those grounds alone. You would have to say, because this gets into newspapers, because it gets people to think about, oh, are chimpanzees really persons? What does that mean? What can they do? How do they relate to other chimpanzees? People start to not see animals as so separate from us, and I think that could have a beneficial effect on the whole animal movement. And if there's a justification for the Non-Human Rights Project, it's got to be that, I think. It's got to be changing those attitudes.
Yeah, so one of the projects we're actually working on at the moment, the one I've been focusing on, is the Social Movements Project. And basically we're trying to see what the effect of previous social movement tactics were. And so it would be really fundamental things like the rights that you give to certain individuals. At this point, it's quite a new project, so we don't really know which tactics would be effective, but those could certainly be effective and sustainable ways of creating change for non-human animals.
That actually leads into the next question, which I was going to ask. What do you think is, so you talk about speciesism, do you think, what are the relative similarities between speciesism and other kind of isms like sexism and racism, and to what extent can we use tactics that were used in the civil rights movement and by the feminist movement directly and import them into the animal movement, or are there any key differences that mean the tactics we should use are different?
Well, obviously one key difference is that the animals aren't going to stand up for themselves and protest, and that was particularly the case in the feminist movement, and to some extent obviously it was also a case in the anti-slavery movement, although somewhat less because they were much more liable to be severely punished if they did. So in fact, a lot of the impetus for the anti-slavery movement had to come from whites, not from the slaves themselves. And so the parallel is probably politically closer with the anti-slavery movement than with the feminist movement. But I think the anti-slavery movement is encouraging because it is an example of what you could see as reasonably pure altruism. That is, if you think of, I think particularly say of the anti-slave trade movement, which started in England in the late 18th century and was successful in the early 19th century, so quite a while before the anti-slavery movement was successful in the United States. But so there was a slave trade, which was quite lucrative, maybe like our coal trade with China, which also has its moral problems. And you had to get a group of people saying, even though this may contribute to the economic prosperity of our country, it's wrong and we should not be doing it. And that argument did carry the day. Britain abolished the slave trade and paid, I think, £20 million, which was a substantial sum in those days, in compensation to slave owners in the British colonies. So I think that is an example, although historically it's very different circumstances now, but I find that an encouraging example. I don't know if you've thought of...
Yeah, well, one of the things we think is going to be particularly promising is because of the fact that animals can't be their own proponents. We think that children's rights movements might be pretty insightful in that regard, because in most of the cases it was their parents were concerned individuals that were really working on that. It wasn't the children themselves. And there's some times in history where the analogies between say factory farmed animals and say children used for labour, say in 18th century England, are pretty similar. There was a strong economic incentive to exploit both groups of people, and in both cases it was mainly sort of moral, rational arguments and sort of authors which try to encourage taking the moral position of that individual, so empathizing. So there was Charles Dickens, who was probably the most famous anti-children's labour sort of proponent. And so, in both cases, it's a sort of taking the position of the oppressed, and it's because of the case of children, we think it could be, pretty strong analogy and a pretty encouraging case to look into.
Excellent. So unfortunately, that's all we have time for, but can I hear a round of applause for our panel?